Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 254. O brother, where art thou? In our last episode, Manco Inca launched his great rebellion. Manco had by now realized that the Spaniards were playing him for a fool. He was ready to chance everything on the roll of a dice. And when we last ended, he was supremely confident. His armies had Francisco Pizarro pinned down around what he was calling Los Reyes, what we would call Lima. Hernando Pizarro and his brother Gonzalo were holding on for dear life in Cusco. Outnumbered thousands to one, the Spaniards hoped their ability to force the Inca from their main fortress to the north of the city would change their situation. But though their situation might have improved, which it had, they were still vastly outnumbered and needed some way to break through Manco's armies, which had only gotten, let's say, fractionally easier. If Hernando and Gonzalo were going to survive, they would need to keep gambling and winning. Francisco Pizarro did not learn about the assault on Cusco or Manco Inca's rebellion until May the 4th, 1536, 2 days before the massive Inca assault on the capital. Pizarro fired off 2 frantic letters to his brothers, telling them that he was sending aid as quickly as he could. Neither letter made it. One, however, survived. In its patchwork, it reads as follows. Magnificent Sir, today I arrived in the city of Kings, Lima, after a visit to the cities of San Miguel and the newly founded city of Trujillo, with the intention of resting after so many hardships and dangers. But before I could even get off my horse, they gave me some letters from you and from my brothers, through which I was informed of the rebellion of that traitor, the Inca Emperor. This greatly troubles me, on account of the detriment it will cause to the service of the Emperor, our Lord, and the danger that you are in, and of the trouble it will cause me in my old age. I am greatly consoled by your presence there in Cusco, and if it is the will of God, we will rescue those of you there. And thus I leave you, praying to our Lord to watch over and to aid your magnificent person. Dated the 5th of May, 1536. Signed, Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro had only founded the City of Kings 4 months earlier. He named it the City of Kings because it was established on the Feast of Epiphany, also known as the Feast of the Magi, or the Three Kings, as they're often called in the United States. Lying on a flat desert plain, the city was bordered by the Rimac River, which literally meant the speaker in Inca. Rimac, believe it or not, is later going to be corrupted into the city's present name, Lima. Since his arrival in Peru for the second time, Francisco Pizarro had scarcely stopped to rest. He had defeated and killed Atahualpa, crowned Manco Inca, and set out to build what would become the capital of Spanish South America. No one understood the need to win the peace so much as Francisco Pizarro. He still had less than 600 total Spaniards at his disposal, against an empire of perhaps 500 million. That means his men were outnumbered about 10,000 to 1. The kinds of unforced errors his brothers were busy making, as though they were, going out of style, would not have worked in the best of circumstances. And these were not the best of circumstances. The fact of the matter was that Pizarro and his fellow Spaniards controlled only a few tiny pockets of the Inca Empire. And yes, for the moment I'm going to totally ignore Almagro and his army, which is somewhere working its way north in present-day Chile. Pizarro's power emanated outward because of his alliance with Manco Inca. Hence, when the alliance disappeared, his extended power disappeared. Pizarro realized that if Manco Inca would be able to take Cusco, not only would he lose over half of his brothers, but he would likely lose half of his available forces as well. The conquest of Peru would need to start all over again. And this time there would be no fooling a gullible Manco Inca that he was on his side. Hence, Pizarro did what he could and dispatched 2 forces toward Cusco immediately. Essentially, he sent one north and one south over different passes through the Andes toward Cusco. Pizarro really thought that he had Manco Inca outfoxed on this occasion. But little did he realize, Manco had already sent a massive army whose sole purpose it was to block any relief force from leaving Lima. Pizarro sent 2 forces of cavalry into the mountains. One was led by Gonzalo de Tapia. Tapia's column was to follow the Inca road south on the coast for nearly 100 miles, and then take a branch east that climbed into the Andes. Eventually, the cavalry unit would turn south into the main Inca highway and take it all the way to Cusco. What neither Pizarro nor his captains realized, however, was that Manco had already sent a native army north from Cusco under the command of one of his generals, with orders to pin down Pizarro's forces in Lima and prevent Pizarro from relieving the besieged mountain capital. By now, Spanish forces in Lima, Jawa, and Cusco were operating in a virtual information blackout, unable to communicate with one another. Not only had the Incas succeeded in severing the Spaniards' lines of communications, but they had also been busy redesigning their military tactics. After 3.5 years of occupation, Manco's generals knew by now something of the strengths and weaknesses of Spanish military techniques. Attacking Spanish cavalry while on level ground was essentially suicide, no matter how many native troops there were. They also knew that the only successes their troops had had thus far had been attacking the Spaniards on terrain so rough that the cavalry was useless. Now, with advanced knowledge of 2 Spanish columns moving slowly between jagged heights and narrow passes of the Andes, and taking into account everything that he knew about the invaders, General Cusco, probably the most important Inca general moving forward, carefully made his plans. According to one chronicler, quote, the Inca strategy was the following. They would allow the Spaniards to enter a deep, narrow gorge, and, seizing the entrance and exit with a great mass of Indians, they would then hurl down such a quantity of rocks and boulders from the hillsides, they would kill them all, almost without having to come to grips with them. End quote. The strategy was simple. Use the geography of the Andes against the Spaniards. And soon enough, this became the #1 operating principle of the Inca army. One group of Pizarro's men, as I mentioned, was riding south before turning east. One day, half drowsing in their saddles and climbing slowly up the canyon toward a pass, these Spaniards were abruptly jolted awake when masses of native warriors suddenly appeared ahead seemingly from nowhere. Cusco's troops charged toward the column, launching a volley of sling-driven stones that slammed into the cavalrymen at the front. Caught by surprise, Tapia, the man I mentioned before, and his men turned their horses around and raced back down the canyon, only to find the bridge over the river they had just used disappeared. Native warriors had dismantled it soon after the Spaniards had ridden across. Surrounded now by sheer canyon walls and with an impassable river between themselves and safety, the Spaniards were trapped. As the men shouted to one another, wheeling their horses around and trying to decide what to do, a noise as loud as a canyon suddenly erupted in their midst. A huge boulder had smashed into the ground from above, crushing a number of riders and horses, and spraying others with a deadly shrapnel of rocks. Looking up, the Spaniards saw in horror that natives lining the canyon walls were pushing more boulders over the edge, and that others were already crashing down. Amid the noise and confusion and the cries of the wounded, the Spaniards knew one thing for certain. They had been caught like rats in a prepared trap. 2, 3, and now 4 more boulders hit the ground, exploding on impact and taking groups of horses and their riders down with them. Uninjured horses neighed, wounded horses screamed, and Spaniards just shouted to each other in confusion as boulder after boulder after boulder continued to crash down upon them. Some tried to escape, bolting with their horses forward or back, but these just ran into a sling of stones and arrows shot by jungle archers. A few slammed their horses into the masses of warriors, slashing at the natives with their swords. But soon a sea of hands surrounded them and pulled the Spaniards from their mounts. Thrown to the ground, these armored invaders immediately disappeared, never to return. General Cusco, more than likely, witnessed his carefully designed ambush from a perch atop the canyon rim. He watched with satisfaction as wounded Spaniards crawled on the ground pursued by native troops, who used their heavy wooden clubs to mash in their skulls. Other warriors grabbed the now riderless horses by the reins, a few of which reared up but were unable to escape. Within about a half an hour, a force of 70 Spaniards had been reduced to a few crawling survivors. But as I mentioned, there were 2 columns of riders. But Cusco now, he knew what to do. In another high, narrow canyon, similar to that which Gonzalo de Tapia's men had been crushed, Cusco staged his next ambush. There, the Inca general caught the entire force of 60 Spaniards by surprise, and quite literally crushed them with an avalanche of boulders. Cusco's legions then clubbed the survivors to death. Here's one recount. Quote, "The Inca, General Cusco, seized many supplies that these dead Spaniards were carrying from Spain, brocades and silk and other rich garments, and a lot of wine and foodstuffs, and swords and lances they later used against us. And they had more than 100 horses, and they had also seized much artillery," end quote. Determined to continue this methodical campaign, General Cusco now marched his army north to the city of Jauja, which was still inhabited by a community of a couple dozen Spaniard encomiendo owners. Years of unbroken military successes and arrogance had lulled these Spanish inhabitants into a false sense of security. Assuming that this force of 60 soldiers was still in the area, the ones who had just been crushed to death by boulders, the encomienda owners ignored reports by their frightened servants that a large native army was now approaching the city. Chronicler Martin de Mura describes, quote, "The Spaniards received news that they, the native warriors, were coming to kill them, but they paid no attention, nor did they respect them at all, saying, 'Let these dogs come to where we are waiting for them, and we will cut them all to pieces, even if they come with twice the number they already have.' And for this reason, they didn't want to take any precautions nor fortify themselves in the central area, nor post guards or lookouts, nor place spies on the road so they could be warned when the Indians were near," end quote. So unfortunately for them, the Spanish encomienda owners failed to perceive the imminent danger around them. That evening, General Cusco's troops encircled the small town of Jauja. At dawn, he gave the order to attack. The Spanish destruction was almost instantaneous. Caught off guard, those who could quickly made their way to the town center for an Alamo-like final stand. It did not make a difference. General Cusco had overwhelming numbers, and this time the Spanish did not have cavalry to save them. Even with their superior military technology, slowly but surely, each of them was bludgeoned to death. Well, all except one. He escaped, maybe he was allowed to escape, and made his way back to Lima, where he soon informed a distraught Francisco Pizarro about the latest catastrophe. With each passing day, no doubt Pizarro became more and more certain that his dream of ruling the Inca Empire was slipping from his grasp. For the first time since the Spaniards had arrived in Peru 4 years earlier, an Incan general had successfully eliminated not one, but 4 different Spanish forces, 3 of which were composed of cavalry. How the tide had turned. 2 months prior, Francisco Pizarro commanded 500 Spanish troops and had control over a puppet emperor. Now, said puppet emperor was leading a rebellion, which had, in the past 60 days, wiped out about 1/3 of his troops. And his own brother Juan was amongst the dead. Keep this up, and Francisco would join him before too long. All of this wore on Francisco Pizarro. One chronicler described him at the time as follows, quote, "The governor was greatly troubled after seeing all the bad things that had happened, because he had already had 4 dead captains and almost 200 dead men and many horses. And he also knew for certain that the city of Cusco was either in great danger or was already lost. And if the latter, then his brothers and all the people in it were dead. And for this reason, and seeing himself with so few people, he was very distraught, fearing the loss of this land. For there wasn't a day when someone didn't come to tell him that such and such chief has rebelled, or in such an area, so many Christians have died who had gone looking for food." End quote. Pizarro had discovered that the Inca knew how to defeat his cavalry, but discovered it too late. If he had been aware, there's no way Pizarro would have had just sent 100 cavalry men to their deaths. He believed them to be invulnerable, which only months before they had been. For once, the Spanish were on the losing end of the information war. The Inca simply knew more about what was going on than they did. Fearing that his 2 brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, might likewise be dead, Pizarro sent an emergency SOS appeal to the various Spanish governors living elsewhere in the Americas. We have the letter that he sent on July the 9th, 1536, to Pedro de Alvarado, Hernan Cortez's former second-in-command, and now the governor of Guatemala. In the letter, Pizarro sounds uncharacteristically meek and chastened. He wrote to Alvarado as follows: "The Inca Emperor Manco has the city of Cusco besieged, and I have heard nothing about the Spaniards in it. The country is so badly damaged that no native chief now serves us, and they have won many victories against us. It is causing me such great sorrow that it is consuming my entire life, as well as fear of losing my governorship. I beg of you to send me some help, because not only would it be doing His Majesty a great service, but it would also be doing me a favor, and would save the lives of those who are here in Lima. You can be sure that if we are not rescued, that Cusco will be lost, and then the rest of us will be lost, because we are few and have almost no weapons, and the Indians are fearless. I will not say more, except that it will cost you little to perform this service for our Royal Majesty, and to grant the favor that both his realm and myself request. And even if it costs a lot to help us Christians, everyone will be grateful for it. May the Lord grant your magnificent person as prosperous life as you desire. Signed, Francisco Pizarro." Pizarro's letters eventually wound their way through Central America, into the Caribbean, and finally to Spain. Evidently, the postal service still worked fine. King Charles undoubtedly read the news with equal feelings of consternation and hopelessness. He was counting on his 20% of Manco's gold and silver to finance his European wars. Never a man with a ton of liquid capital on hand, Charles and his Council of the Indies did, nevertheless, spring into action. One Spaniard wrote the following from Panama, quote, "The Lord of Cusco and of the entire realm has rebelled. The rebellion has spread from province to province, and suddenly they are all rising up. Rebellious chiefs have already arrived 40 leagues, about 140 miles, from the city of the kings, that's Los Reyes or Lima. Governor Pizarro is asking for help, and will be given everything possible from here. We will send someone there with as much money as will be needed, and we are asking that as many people come as are able, along with the greatest amount of artillery, harquebuses, and crossbows." Of course, all this would take time. For all Charles knew, by the time that letter got from Pizarro reached him, the rebellion had won, all the Pizarros were dead, and there was nothing to be done. But he still had to try. After all, he had a lot of money on the line. While all this was going on, Manco Inca was celebrating General Quiso's recent victories about 30 miles northwest of Cusco in a fortress temple complex called, and this word is going to be a stretch for me, Ollantaytambo. And that is why I will not be repeating that pronunciation going forward, or at the very least, keeping its mention to a minimum. The fortress was extremely well located and commanded both entrances into the Yucca Valley north of Cusco. Manco, feeling confident, now addressed his native chiefs and military officers. "My sons and brothers, in past talks, you already know how I prevented you from inflicting harm on those evil people through deceit of saying they were the sons of the Creator God, which I permitted for this reason and helped them, giving what I had, silver, gold, clothing, corn, alpacas, men, women, children, and innumerable other things. But they seized me, beat me, and mistreated me without my having merited it, and then they tried to kill me. It had caused me grief that, you being so many and they being so few, they escaped from your hands. Perhaps the gods helped them, for you have told me that they were on their knees every night praying. For if he did not help them, then how did they escape from your hands with so many of you? What is done is done. From now on, be aware of them, for they are our worst enemies, and we will perpetually be theirs. I want to strengthen my position in this town and make a fortress here that no one will be able to penetrate. Do me this favor because one day we may need to make use of it." Manco was feeling optimistic, and why not? It seemed like every day better and better news was coming in. Recalled one Inca witness, quote, "During this period, messengers arrived with news of the destruction that had been carried out in Lima and Jauja, where the battle had occurred between the Indians and the Spaniards, in which the Indians had been victorious. And they brought my father, that is Manco Inca, many heads of Spaniards, and 2 live Spaniards, and a black man and 4 horses, which arrived a great rejoicing for those victories. And my father accepted these gifts very honorably, and infused everyone with a desire to fight with equal vigor," end quote. Knowing that General Quiso had wiped the central Andes of the hated invaders, and with the other 2 Pizarro brothers holed up in Cusco, Manco Inca sent the following message to his best general: "March to Lima and eliminate Francisco Pizarro." Once he did that, which Manco Inca had no doubt he would do with great ease, then Quiso could march back to Cusco, link up with the remaining armies, and together they could eliminate the Spaniards once and for all. Back in Cusco, things were getting desperate. 190 men were trapped within the capital. Sure, they had taken the fortress of Sascosaman, but they were running out of supplies and had heard nothing from the outside world. With no communication from the other brothers or from any other Spaniards, those who were within Cusco had no idea what was going on. Daily, however, Manco's forces continued to attack the Spaniards and their native auxiliaries. A number of captains now urged Hernando Pizarro to assemble a small group of their finest cavalry to break out of the city and ride for help on the coast. Others countered this argument. They said breaking out of the city, or even attempting to, was a suicide mission and would cost those remaining precious horses. Many men argued either they needed to attempt to break out altogether, or they needed to stay and fight altogether. In the end, Hernando went with option A. He picked 15 of his best horsemen and decided that that group would attempt to break out. He believed that he had to get word to Lima. But then, just as dawn broke the next morning, a tattered message arrived. It came stuffed within a pile of severed Spanish heads. No doubt, as the men looked down at horror at the heads of some of the men sent to carry the message to Cusco from Lima, they wondered how the letter, incomplete as it was, had found its way to them. According to one witness, one day before the Spaniards were to set out just after Mass, many Indians on the surrounding hills began to shout, and they left 5 heads of Christians and more than 1,000 ripped-up letters on the road. The Indians had seized these letters and killed some Christians whom the governor had sent to rescue the city. The Indians had brought these things so that we could see them and know what had happened, and so that we would become more discouraged. But on the contrary, this gave us life and rejuvenated us, because by way of these letters, we found out what we wanted to know, that the governor and his men were alive, and we learned about the victory that the Emperor Charles V had against the Moors in the capture of Tunis. End quote. Convincing Manco to send the letter with the severed heads had been the suggestion of one of Manco's Spanish prisoners. He convinced the Inca emperor that seeing these useless scraps of paper would send those within Cusco into even more of a panic. Evidently, after 3 years, Manco still did not understand even the very purpose of writing. Thus, without realizing it, Manco had just sent into Cusco a literal treasure trove of information. Reinvigorated by the knowledge that his brother Francisco was probably still alive, Hernando canceled the attempt to reach the coast and instead decided that perhaps he and the rest of his trapped Spaniards might try to crush the Inca rebellion in a bold move. His spies had informed Hernando that Manco Inca was presently headquartered at Ollantaytambo, some 30 miles northwest of Cusco. If Hernando could strike directly at the emperor, capturing or killing him, then the trapped Spaniards might be able to break the back of the rebellion. Manco's cousin, Pasac, meanwhile, continued to fight on the side of the Spaniards. He could then be placed on the throne. So leaving 50-foot soldiers in control of their main fortress and another 40 in the city below, Hernando now led a force of 70 cavalry and 30-foot soldiers, together with a variety of Inca auxiliaries, out of the city. Hernando's goal was a simple one: to seize or kill the leader of the rebellion, Manco Inca himself. Hernando and his men soon fought their way down into the narrow, flat Yucca Valley plain. They followed the UK River for some time before it led them to the massive fortress headquarters of Manco Inca. Reported Pedro Pizarro, quote, "When we arrived, we found Ollantaytambo so well fortified that it was a horrifying sight. For the place is very strong, with very high terraces, and with very large and well-fortified stone walls. It has but one entrance that is against a very steep hill, and on the hill were many warriors with many boulders, which they had up in order to hurl them down whenever the Spaniards dared to enter and attempt to capture the fortress gate." End quote. Hernando's men gathered on the plain below the fortress, and soon they noticed a new type of Inca warrior. Before them were what looked like legions of warriors, wielding nothing less than what appeared to be medieval longbows. These were warriors from the Amazon, and although the Inca had always incorporated Amazonian warriors into their armies, as those were the only people from the jungle who knew how to use bows and arrows, the Spaniards were surprised to see that so many of these people had suddenly appeared. Unlike the inhabitants of the Andes, many of the Antis natives, which is what they were called, painted their faces with dyes. Others more than likely had various feathers from tropical birds sprouting from their skin, noses, and mouths. When the Spaniards rode too close to the fortress walls, slews of arrows immediately arced into the sky, bearing sharpened bamboo and palm wood points, many of which hit the armored men and their horses. The aim of the Amazonians, Hernando soon discovered, was very, very good. Hernando's cavalry continued to circle and skirmish, while the Spanish foot soldiers fought with the ever bolder Indian troops. Then, without warning, the Spaniards noticed the suddenly previously dry ground begin to grow moist, then wet. Then, the foot soldiers found themselves knee-deep in water. Manco had unleashed a new secret weapon. He had opened up the gates controlling the Pachata River. Soon the water had risen so high that it reached the belly of the Spanish horses. Quote, "The Indians, without our knowing it, turned the river into the plain where we were, and had we waited longer we would have all died. Yet when he understood the trick the Indians had played on us, and that it was impossible to take the village at this time, Hernando Pizarro ordered us to retreat. And as the night drew darker, he sent all the foot soldiers ahead with the baggage, and some mounted troops to guard it. And he himself with the other troops took the middle, and he ordered his brother Gonzalo Pizarro, along with a few more of us cavalrymen, to bring up the rear. And in this way we retreated." End quote. Hence, against very difficult circumstances, the Spanish managed to carry out a forced retreat. Somehow, Hernando and his men struggled across the flooded valley and reached the heights on the other side. The next day, these same exhausted men fought their way back to Cusco, having lost several horses and suffering a variety of men wounded. Meanwhile, 400 miles away and roughly 11,000 feet lower in elevation, Francisco Pizarro anxiously awaited for reinforcements from abroad and wondered whether his brothers in Cusco were still alive. Pizarro was still receiving reports from various spies that a massive Inca army was assembling nearby for an attack on Lima. This was the same army, his spies no doubt told him, led by one General Cusco, this man who had wiped out Pizarro's relief forces and massacred the Spaniards in Jauja. General Cusco, they told him, had vowed to destroy every bearded invader on the coast, exactly as he had done in the mountains. Because of recent losses, only 100 or so Spaniards were alive to defend what would be Lima one day, and what was then still referred to as Los Reyes. Needless to say, the city was at a breaking point. Fear and panic ran through the streets. No ships had arrived, bearing any reinforcement. Then, in late winter, so like September, remember, Southern Hemisphere, the news that everyone had been dreading finally arrived. Quote, "The conquistador Diego de Agua presently arrived, having fled to the City of Kings, and reported that the Indians were up in arms and had tried to set him on fire in their villages. A great army of them was approaching, the news of which deeply terrified the city, all the more because of how few Spaniards were in it." Almost immediately, more news followed. Auxiliary Indians from outside the City of Kings arrived, complaining that great quantities of Indian warriors were coming down from the mountains to destroy them, killing their women and children. The governor sent Pedro de Lerma with 20 cavalry in order to find out what was going on and to scout the area. Lerma left that night, and only 2 leagues, about 7 miles, from the city, he found himself besieged by 50,000 Indian warriors. So the rumors of the impending attack, it seemed, were true. In reality, General Cusco had spent months gathering up additional levies and preparing his men for the battle to come. He could have attacked much sooner, but he felt he needed the extra men. You see, he was confident that he could destroy Spaniards in the mountains. But as of now, no one had yet determined how to defeat Spanish cavalry on level ground. There, they remained invincible. But Manco had given his best general clear instructions. He was to march to Lima and destroy this fledgling Spanish city. He was to capture Pizarro and bring him back to Manco as a prisoner. But everyone else was to be slaughtered. Los Reyes, or whatever the Spanish were calling the settlement, was to be wiped off the map. Then Quiso was to march back to Cusco to help Manco finish off the Spaniards there. Now, as I mentioned, General Quiso fully realized that the strength and speed of the Spanish horses could only be neutralized by steep topography. Horses, it turned out, even more so than men, simply weren't good at running up steep hills. As long as his men controlled the heights, Quiso had the advantage. In the case of the Spanish city on the coast, however, which Quiso's scouts had no doubt built small clay models of him to study, the general quickly saw that his troops would be forced to abandon the protection of the hills and would have to attack the Spaniards on flat terrain. There, they could certainly expect to be attacked by Pizarro's cavalry. As the Inca general studied the clay models and examined the representations of the hills around the city, he undoubtedly realized that Manco's order to attack Pizarro's coastal city was going to be the most difficult challenge of his life. General Quiso decided to attack Lima from 3 sides, north, east, and south. He would use his overwhelming numbers to slowly crush the Spaniards within, just as Manco was doing in Cusco. After arriving outside the town, Cusco gave his men a night's rest, and then he issued the order to attack. Quiso's forces now began a pincer-like movement toward the city, advancing across the plain to the sound of the Inca's traditional music of conch shells, clay, trumpets, and drums. From above, the divisions looked like a 3-sided clamp that was slowly crushing the city. Pizarro, meanwhile, had stationed his 80 cavalry within the city, hidden from sight. When Quiso's divisions finally began arriving at the city's outskirts, and the rest of the attacking troops were now well exposed on the plain, Pizarro gave his own signal to attack. A group of harquebusers now suddenly appeared, firing their weapons, their heavy barrels issuing clouds of smoke and their lead balls ripping into the attackers. Next came the inevitable cavalry charge. With lances and swords drawn and shouting, the Spaniards galloped rapidly towards the attackers' front lines, smashing into them and then slashing downward with their swords, thrusting with their spears. The Spaniards' native auxiliaries, meanwhile, far more numerous than the conquistadors, also charged out, counterattacking the Inca troops with stone and bronze-tipped clubs. Fierce fighting commenced, although as usual, the warriors' clubs and sling stones were simply no match for the armored Spaniards. Although Quiso's troops had succeeded in reaching the outskirts of the city, it was there that the Inca attack stalled, as the Spanish foot soldiers, cavalry, and native auxiliaries fought fiercely to prevent Los Reyes from being overrun. All afternoon the battle raged, with the Spaniards' armored cavalry exacting a deadly and unequal toll on Quiso's troops. Finally, the Inca general ordered his forces to retreat to the hills ringing the city, knowing that the steep escarpments there would protect from further cavalry attacks. Quiso and his own division retired to the tall, brown sugarloaf-like hill that is now called Cerro San Cristobal, and now rises over Lima from across the bay. For the next 5 days, Manco's finest general laid siege to Pizarro's city, with the Spaniards having to fight fiercely each day to prevent it from being overrun. On the 6th day, however, Quiso had reached a turning point. Manco had not ordered his veteran general to lay siege to the city, but to take and destroy it, and to put the Spaniards there to death. The constant and unequal attrition, however, was beginning to demoralize the Inca troops. Well aware that Manco's warriors still surrounded Cusco, but had stalemated there for more than 3 months, Quiso felt the pressure to finish the job on the coast and return to assist his emperor. Each day, however, Quiso witnessed from this hilltop position the Spanish cavalry wreak havoc among his native warriors. The only chance he had of breaching the defenses was to risk everything on one throw of the dice. He had to launch one final, overwhelming blow upon the city, and this time he himself would lead the charge. Calling for an assembly of his captains, Quiso waited patiently for them to arrive. From the heights of Cerro San Cristobal, he could easily look out over the city and see the Inca road stretching north, east, and south, while to the west lay the dull, metallic blue ocean. To the east rose the Andes, barely visible. Gradually, Quiso's captains arrived, and once they had assembled, Manco's general stood and gestured down at the Spanish settlement, announcing that he was, quote, determined to enter the city and take it by force or die in the attempt. I intend to enter the town today and kill all the Spaniards who are in it. Those who accompany me must go with the understanding that if I die, all will die, and if I flee, all will flee. The native captains and leaders all agreed to go with him, end quote. And so General Quiso launched his final assault on Los Reyes. Quote, the entire native army began to move with a vast array of banners, from which the Spaniards recognized the determination and will they were coming with. Pizarro ordered all the cavalry to form into 2 squadrons. He placed one squadron under his command in ambush in one street, and the other squadron in another. The enemy was already advancing across the open plain by river. They were very magnificent men, for all had been hand-picked. The General Quiso was advancing in front of them, wielding a lance. While it seemed certain that Pizarro was doomed, the Inca military power structure had one fatal flaw. Inca armies always placed their leaders in the front line. Pizarro knew by now that if he could kill Quiso, then the entire command structure would collapse. Pizarro had been brought up in the European tradition. He never led his forces personally. Now, Pizarro, realizing that this might be his last and only chance to survive, he launched an attack aimed straight at General Quiso. A chronicler tells us what happens next. Quote, General Quiso crossed both branches of the Rimac River in his litter. Seeing that the enemy warriors were starting to enter the streets of the city and some of Quiso's men were moving on the tops of the walls, the Spanish cavalry charged out and attacked with such great determination that since the ground was flat, they routed them instantly. The General Quiso was left there, dead, and so were 40 commanders and other chiefs alongside him. Although it seemed as if our men had specially selected them, they were killed because they were marching at the head of their men, and thus they were the first that the Spaniards smashed into. The Spaniards continued to kill and wound Indians as far as the foot of the hill of San Cristobal, at which point they encountered a very strong resistance from the defensive site they had made, end quote. When night fell on the battlefield, though the Inca army outnumbered its opponents still by at least 1,000 to 1, it melted away. Without a leader, the soldiers simply gave up and went home. The army might have been fine in terms of manpower, but psychologically, it was crushed. 3 days later, a breathless runner tore into the Inca camp north of Cusco. He delivered the shocking news to a stone-faced Manco Inca. Quiso, his best general, was dead. His army all but vanished. Francisco Pizarro remained alive, his city and his small army intact. It was a complete reversal. Manco had him. He had Pizarro on the ropes. And somehow, Pizarro had survived. The news was utterly devastating, but if Manco that day was looking around for someone to blame, that man wasn't the now dead General Quiso. Manco had ignored what Quiso had learned, namely that they could beat the Spaniards in the mountains, but nowhere else. In the end, Quiso's last charge could only go down as one of those romantic but hopeless last stands, like the charge of the Light Brigade maybe, or Pickett's charge in the American Civil War. Now there was nothing Manco could really do to stop Pizarro from linking up with his brothers. The army that could have once stopped up all the gaps and held the two forces apart was gone. And worse news arrived immediately thereafter. A column of 400 armed Spaniards had just reached the southern border of Peru. Diego de Almagro, Pizarro's old partner, was back. If you've enjoyed the show, feel free to check out the additional content on westerncivpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the show and get ad-free and bonus content, check out the link to the Patreon page. And if you'd like to hear the whole story of Western civilization over, but more detailed and, at least initially, in much better audio quality, check out Western Civ 2.0. Link also in the show notes. If you try it, you get a 7-day free trial.